Hello and good afternoon, and welcome to the first Center for Indigenous Knowledges and Languages research seminar of 2023, entitled Walking Together, an investigation of Indigenous students' relationship to the academic library. My name is Sean Hillier. I'm a Mi'kmaq scholar from the Halapu First Nation, an associate professor in the School of Health Policy and Management, a York Research Chair in Indigenous Health Policy, and now the interim director for the Center for Indigenous Knowledges and Languages. A few housekeeping items that I'd like to start off with is that we ask that you turn off your camera and keep yourself muted unless you're asking a question. We will begin today's lecture with a virtual territorial acknowledgement. As this meeting is virtual and we're not all gathered in the same place, I recognize that this land acknowledgement might not be for the territory that you are currently on. I ask that if this is the case, that you take on the responsibility to acknowledge the traditional territory that you are on and its current treaty holders. As a member of the York University community, I recognize that many Indigenous nations have long-standing relationships with the territories upon which York University campuses are located that precede the establishment of our institution. York University acknowledges its presence on the traditional territory of many Indigenous nations. The area known as Toronto has been caretaken by the Anishinaabe Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Huron-Wendat. It is now home to many First Nation, Inuit, and Métis communities. We acknowledge the current treaty holders, the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. We also acknowledge that this territory is subject to the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, which is an agreement to peacefully share and care for the Great Lakes region. This land acknowledgement is the beginning of responsibilities incumbent upon York University administrators, our faculty, and our staff throughout our institution. In response to the continuously growing need for culturally responsive and relational library services and workers, a team at the University of Toronto, in collaboration with others, carried out a research project asking Indigenous undergraduate and graduate students to share their thoughts towards and perceptions of the University of Toronto libraries. Today, we're pleased to have with us our special guests, Desmond Wong, who is the Outreach Librarian at the University of Toronto Libraries, May Chan, the Head of Metadata Services at the University of Toronto Libraries, Tina Leo, who is the Business and Economics Librarian at the Wilfrid Laurier University, and Cora Cody, the Indigenous Teaching and Learning Librarian here at York University. Each will discuss the insights shared by Indigenous students and will reflect upon the actionable steps academic libraries can take to develop programs to fill gaps in services provided to and used by Indigenous students. The format for today's event will be a group presentation followed by our guests having a moderated question and answer session. During the presentation, we invite you to submit any questions that you have using the Q&A function. I, along with our SICL staff, will be monitoring that throughout the event. However, we'll take up those Q&As at the end of the presentation. So I'll pass it over to you, Cora.
Hello, I'm Cora Cody. I am the Indigenous Teaching and Learning Librarian here at York University. I'm also a member of the Mississauga of the Credit First Nation with paternal settler ancestry, and I currently live in Toronto.
Hi, I'm Tina. I am a Chinese immigrant. My family roots are mostly from southern China, and I am very much a settler who is continuing to work on educating myself to be better about just in general reconciliation work.
Hi, I'm May. I'm second generation Chinese Canadian settler of Cantonese descent with roots in colonial in Hong Kong and Taishan and from the province of Guangdong in China. I was born on the unceded land stewarded by the Coast Tsimshian peoples, Prince Rupert, that is, area. And prior to the move to Toronto, I've lived most of my life on the unceded lands of the Coast Salish. And identifying as a settler and a person of color publicly is new and unsettling still to me. But at the same time, I do feel that acknowledging these identities is also a source of constant tension that motivates me to do the work of addressing discriminatory infrastructures at institutional levels.
Hello, everyone. My name is Desmond Wong. I am the outreach librarian over at the University of Toronto Libraries, excuse me, along with being the Indigenous Studies librarian at the university as well as the person who is responsible for selecting for, which means buying the books and the materials for Indigenous Studies at the university as well. I am a settler. I trace my ancestry back through Hong Kong and China. And while Hong Kong was a colonial territory, that is where my family comes from. And so I have a deep and abiding understanding of colonialism, and that I hope will help me clarify and understand my relationships to colonialism, settler colonialism, and reinforce Indigenous resurgence, nationhood, and sovereignties in the spaces where I am currently residing. I have lived and was born in Tegurundo and have lived here for most of my life. So having said that, I'd like to go straight into our presentation, which is called Walking Together, an investigation of Indigenous students' relationship to the academic library. So first, I'd like to center and recognize that our research and our obligations in relation to the lands on which it was conducted. This research and the research team worked on lands that have been stewarded by Indigenous nations since time immemorial. The intention of our research was to focus on the needs of Indigenous students, and those needs cannot and will not be separated from the lands and waters from which their knowledges and connections derive. The lands of Toronto have been the home to many nations, including the Wendat, the Seneca, and the current treaty holders and partners, the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. We continue to recognize the sovereignty and stewardship of the Mississaugas of the Credit, and this work seeks only to strengthen our commitment and our praxis towards continued resurgence, self-determination, and the return of land. Our team consists of 4 people, all of whom are racialized, as you have heard. This includes 1 Indigenous researcher and 3 East Asian research team members. At the time of our research, 2 of the research team members were academic library interns, while 2 were librarians. But as you've heard, we have since become a team of 4 librarians. As a research team, we had various connections to the community that participated in our study, including as active community members and as a liaison librarian to various departments and services that served Indigenous students. Now I will pass it over to Tina.
Right, so as academic libraries continue to work through their obligations and their understandings of working with Indigenous users, gaps in knowledge, sensitivity, and cultural understanding have emerged and widened. And so in response to this growing need for culturally responsive and relational library services and workers, we carried out a research project at the University of Toronto where we asked Indigenous undergraduate and graduate students to share their thoughts towards and their perceptions of the University of Toronto libraries. And through this process, we hope to strengthen the relationship between Indigenous students and the library by allowing library staff and administrators to gain awareness of Indigenous student needs. Steps have been taken towards providing Indigenous students with culturally relevant academic support and services through the Indigenous Education Network, the Center for Indigenous Studies, and First Nations House. With this study, we aim to assess the library's ability to meet the needs of Indigenous students and to identify areas where the library can improve research support to Indigenous students.
As Tina stated, our purpose was to assess the library's ability to meet the needs of Indigenous students and to identify areas where the library can improve research support to Indigenous students. There have been very few studies in the past that have captured the perspectives of Indigenous students on college and university libraries. As we were preparing to do our research, we found that one of the most recent studies published on the issue was one conducted in 1999 by Deborah Lee, who was a librarian at, or she was studying at University of Alberta at the time, and now she's a librarian at University of Saskatchewan. So while much has changed globally and technologically in the past 20 years, the library still has some very similar issues in regards to how it has Indigenous materials categorized and described, as well as a lack of Indigenous resources that are housed within the library system. However, we did decide that we would like to get the perspective of the students at U of T, not only because it's been 20 years since anybody has really checked on students to see how they're doing with things, but also because U of T is a different location from the University of Alberta, and there are certainly things that are dependent upon how people interact with the resources. It's very strongly affected with the environment they're housed in, as well as, since times have changed technologically, we want to know if that has helped or hindered or changed things from the student perspective at all. So the University of Toronto Libraries has an overwhelming amount of resources available to students. It also has had several years of engaged outreach through Desmond, but not all of our findings from our research can be generalized to other institutions. However, I think that there are some observations that are worthy of consideration for all libraries. Additionally, conducting this research was a good way for us to strengthen our reciprocal relationships, and we hope that positive change can be made where necessary. So now I will talk about our ethics. So to prepare for our research, we did some reading or reviewing. We learned from Linda Tui-Smith's decolonizing methodologies, Kirkness and Bernhardt's 4 R's of Indigenous research, and Sean Wilson's Indigenous research methodologies, as well as Joanne Archibald's Indigenous story work. As researchers, we're committed to Kirkness and Bernhardt's 4 R's of Indigenous research: respect, relevance, reciprocity, and responsibility. And we were informed by Sean Wilson's Indigenous research methodologies to recognize that knowledge and experiences are fundamentally relational, and thus are affected by interpersonal relationships and relationships with the wider environment. As Linda Tui-Smith further elucidated, our role as researchers is to engage in a study that will lead us to a beneficial change for the Indigenous community. With our commitment to a reciprocal and responsible relationship, we designed our study in a way that respected the participants' time, experience, and information. And now I'll pass it over to Desmond.
Our methods used a multi-pronged approach, combining various qualitative methods. We were guided, as Cora said, by Joanne Archibald's methods and Indigenous story work, conducting focus groups, which we paired with visual methods that prompted participants to comment on various images of the library, as well as to draw their ideal library service. We did so originally also because we had restrictions due to COVID-19 that stopped us from being able to tour students and our participants through the spaces themselves. The focus group questions and the visual prompts were prepared so that participants could speak to their personal experiences, narratives, and effect responses to specific library spaces. Due to the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic, these focus groups were conducted and recorded online. We then transcribed the sessions and sent them to our participants for verification. This was an important step as it gave our participants control of their own narratives and strengthened relations between researcher and participant. Upon receiving confirmation from our student participants on the accuracy of the transcript, we then coded using 2 cycles of thematic coding. I'll now pass it over to May.
So at the forefront of focus group design was the commitment to the 4 R's: respect, relevance, reciprocity, and responsibility through relational accountability. The focus groups were planned for 2 hours to accommodate generative conversation in response to questions with and without the visual component. During the recruitment for focus group participants, we attempted to convey value for reciprocity and respect for participants' time, intentions, and efforts by offering a gift card of their choice, regardless of how far they decided to stay in the research process. Recruitment was targeted, drawing on the Indigenous networks of trust that Desmond has cultivated over many years in his role as the outreach librarian at the University of Toronto. To preserve confidentiality, but also create a relational environment during the focus group, participants were given the option to choose aliases to be referred by during conversation. Excuse me. Reciprocity was expressed to participants by conveying the value of their input into helping with articulating concrete suggestions for how the library system can improve its spaces and services for Indigenous students. Excuse me. Where appropriate, we sharing information about library spaces and services when we figured that the students didn't know about them. Excuse me, I'm just having a coughing fit. Okay, lastly, after cleaning up the transcripts and further anonymizing them, we gave participants a transcript of the session they participated in to review for their permission to use for coding. So these are all things that we did to try to convey a sense of trust, reciprocity, and responsibility for the participants' time and efforts. And now that we've given you an overview of our approach to the research, we're going to turn our attention to the findings. The work of coding the transcripts yielded many recurring themes around safety, Indigenous research needs, relationality, library services and programming, physical space, library collections, and outreach and uptake of specialized library services and spaces, and digital navigation of the library website and catalog. For this presentation, we will touch on findings on all these themes, except for the digital navigation due to time constraints. And then I'm going to provide some context here. The University of Toronto has 39 libraries. Throughout the focus groups, participants spoke on experiences in a number of the libraries they used. But the majority of the information we are presenting on today pertains to the physical space is regarding Robarts Library, which is featured prominently here. Robarts Library is the main library for social sciences and humanities and houses the bulk of the Indigenous resources. As you can see in the picture, it's a very large building with 14 above ground floors and 2 below ground floors. And it's a prime example of brutalist architecture. You'll notice that it has an array of narrow windows what's inside it, though, is that many of our study spaces and bookshelves are in the library are located in the interior. So I'm going to turn this time over to Cora to start talking about our findings on safety.
The study illuminated a variety of findings, but physical and psychological safety were brought up by the majority of our participants. Issues with psychological safety included feeling unsure of their right to be in the library, feeling unwelcome in the space, and not knowing how to negotiate space with other library users. For example, if an individual was taking up an entire table to themselves, how to negotiate space for themselves to sit there, as well as feeling overwhelmed and not knowing where to go to ask for help. Participants also mentioned coming into contact with racist materials when looking for resources on the shelves. Some of the issues around physical safety included being in the dark and isolated places, and then having automatic lights turn off. One participant stated that she would not go to Robarts at night as it wasn't safe. You can see the picture here is of a typical book stack or a shelf of books within Robarts Library, and the strip of lights will turn off if nobody is moving in the aisle. An additional surprise was a conversation we had around an anti-theft sign, which was inadvertently captured in our photo methods. While one participant noted that it made her reluctant to sit there because she'd be concerned with leaving her books and belongings unattended to use the bathroom or to find another resource, another participant noted that as an Indigenous man, he'd have to endure the implications of the sign, as other library users could engage in racial profiling at the site of the sign. And now I will talk about Indigenous research needs. So Indigenous research needs refers to the need to engage with resources and directly relate to Indigenous ways of knowing and Indigenous pedagogy. Acknowledging that Indigenous ways of knowing are complex and diverse, there are fundamental differences between Western and Indigenous epistemologies and pedagogies. Indigenous epistemologies and pedagogies are focused on community-based knowledge, grounded in holism, observation, listening, and experiential learning, while Western knowledge and pedagogy is predicated on the work of individual experts of compartmentalized knowledge. The library was designed to meet the needs of Western knowledge. The study participants referred to several issues within the library system that directly related to their Indigenous research needs. Among these issues was the need for communal learning and the lack of access to oral-based resources. Orality is key to the transmission of knowledge pertinent to the culture, history, and identity of many Indigenous communities. The library was created as an institution that prioritizes the circulation of the written word and has traditionally been ill-equipped to properly recognize the value of alternative forms of information. One participant stated, "I feel like it is not a place for me, and I think that there is a disconnect between the way Indigenous people learn and things that are coming out of books. If there was a person that I could talk to, I think I'd rather talk to that person. Us having a lot of oral traditions, that's not something that's necessarily captured in aisles and aisles of books." Similarly, the need to engage in communal learning was voiced by a few participants. Oral tradition is carried out by a collective community. Through multiple speakers, knowledge is broadened and enriched. While the written word remains static, the participants described their need for orality as a need to articulate ideas and thoughts around information with others. Other issues that presented barriers to engaging with Indigenous pedagogy and research needs were the lack of resources that participants felt were good, which they meant was to be relevant or ethical. Participants pointed out an overabundance of historical materials and materials that focused on trauma rather than materials that portrayed Indigenous people in a positive light or that focused on resilience. Multiple participants stated that they preferred to use Google Scholar, using the number of citations attached to an article as a means of validating the author's ethics and voice. One participant stated that by using Google Scholar, it's easy for us to see if other Indigenous people have engaged with the article. We see who has cited it and where it has been published. Other reliable sources of finding good resources were Indigenous professors, peers, and committee members whom participants felt were more likely to have a clear understanding of their topics, needs, and ethics. And now I'll pass it back to May.
The theme of relationality has to do with impact of people in shared spaces as users and service providers, as well as seeking help based on trusted relationships. In the focus groups, participants reflected on how people in a shared space can create a positive peer influence in terms of focusing on their studies. But at the same time, people in shared spaces can also be disrupted, resulting in participants seeking out alternative environments. So having choice of study spaces is important when the option to share spaces with like-minded people, like-minded considerate people is lacking. Participants talked about how likely they were to ask for help by discerning how attentive and ready to engage desk staff appeared to be. Some participants suggested that proactive roaming staff in the stacks would encourage them to ask for help more frequently. How likely participants asked for help was influenced by having a relationship with a trusted staff member. So knowing people by name reduces barriers to asking for help. Some participants expressed appreciation for librarians coming to a class to promote library services. And having instructors recommend going to a librarian for help also encouraged participants. Some participants also expressed a preference for human contact instead of self-service machines for basic library services such as checking out books. We see this theme of relationality expressed in many other areas of the findings. I now turn over the time to Tina to talk about services and programming.
So we define library services as the ongoing core function of the library that occurs at all opening hours. And these were generally viewed quite positively by the focus group participants. Responses to certain aspects of services were more mixed. For example, the image of a printing station elicited feelings of confusion and some discomfort towards the circular design of the station from several participants. One participant noted that it looked more like a nurse's station, and as a result, they perceived that they weren't allowed to go in behind a desk, and so they would avoid the area so they wouldn't get into trouble. Library programming was viewed more positively when there was the opportunity for direct human interaction. So library programming differs from services as it's an intentional function put on repeatedly or sporadically by a library worker. And so the primary problem faced by programming is that students were just often unaware of how many available programs there were. For example, workshops. A couple of respondents mentioned that they have attended some library workshops and they reflected positively upon their experiences. And often they found out about workshops through participating in a previous workshop. Our participants indicated that classroom talks were very well received, both because the information given was very helpful and because it puts a face to the library. The benefit of putting a face to the library is that it makes it more welcoming when there's a lot of outreach. And the library is no longer just a big concrete structure once there's a human associated with it. Participants generally agree that they would benefit a lot more if they had more interaction with libraries rather than the aisles of the library. And can we move to the next slide? Yes, thank you. So according to one participant, the University of Toronto Libraries is overwhelming. It's overwhelming. There are a whole bunch of libraries and it's spread out all across campus. So conversations about the physical space of the library, including study spaces, stacks, service desks, windows, greenery, and lighting, were largely critical. The library described as a kind of dull, not a lot of artworks, gray, and a little isolating sometimes, and as a giant concrete prison, isn't regarded by our participants as a particularly welcoming space. That said, not all participants were reluctant to enter the library. One participant remarked that they really liked the architecture of Robarts Library because it evoked the aesthetic of the Halo Media franchise. But everyone who participated in our study remarked on the absence of art and greenery inside the library, as it looks pretty bland and there's no colors. There was a significant amount of discussion surrounding lighting, as the main library has very little natural light inside the building. Participants were generally critical of the fluorescent lighting in the building. And another point of criticism, as Cora briefly mentioned, was that in the stacks, the lights automatically turn off if no movement is sent, which is not great if you are browsing the shelves trying to find an item that you need, or just something to read, fun. And so the physical space has a very strong impact on the kind of work participants were able to get done. A couple of participants share that where they sat in the library, whether it be in study rooms, shared tables, or individual corrals, was dependent on their moods and the type of work they were intending to do. One participant said, windows are important, especially when I'm incubating stuff. Incubation is like a parallel to fasting because you're feeding on the text, on what the book is saying, and you need time to be able to look out a window and reflect. With that, I will now pass it back to Desmond.
So the next point is about collections and what our participants shared with us about collections and their time with collections. So with regards to collections, participants questioned whether there were many Indigenous materials at the library at all. There was an impression that there were many digital materials, but that physical materials could be difficult to get out, to get to, and that students may require or may encounter epistemic or knowledge-based violence while looking for collections of materials. This was based on several questions that felt to a lack of relationship and care. The first was that students did not know who was responsible for acquisitions for Indigenous materials. Next, students felt that the collections process was opaque and were unsure whether there were indeed verifications on materials. The fact that materials by Indigenous people were grouped alongside materials concerning Indigenous peoples, potentially of dubious origins, was of great concern and mirrored across many participants. Virtually all participants shared some form of encountered violence when perusing the stacks, with various coping strategies that they shared with us to avoid these issues. There was no particular consensus on the utility of the open stacks, which means stacks that you can just walk around and wander and look at the shelves, as some participants expressed interest, while others stated that they had never gone to the open stacks directly, as they had no interest or were able to find research materials in other ways. There was an overall impression that the spaces containing materials were an important factor in whether students used or accessed these materials. Participants all reported using digital library materials, with some expressing their ease of use and accessibility, while others preferred to print out materials that were found digitally. However, all of the participants expressed in some way that it was easier to digitally navigate the complex web of relations that are necessary to do responsible Indigenous research at the university, through their web research, and also through understanding some of the coping mechanisms that we have discussed throughout this presentation. So I will now pass it over to Cora to talk about outreach and uptake.
Throughout the focus groups, the participants indicated areas and services that they were unfamiliar with. The information was especially prominent during the visual exercise, as one of the questions asked of participants is whether they were familiar with each location. Understanding the areas in the library that the participants were not aware of may indicate an area of need for increased outreach, promotion, or signage. Specialized areas such as the 3D printer and the family study space were the most unfamiliar. One participant remarked, "I didn't even know that there was a family space at the library. I didn't know. I always waited for my children to go to school so I could run to the library." As previously stated, the participants were also largely unaware of workshops. However, they were aware that they could reach out to Desmond for research consultations, but they were not all aware that they could also access their own subject-specific librarians. And with that, I will pass it back to Desmond.
As we mentioned, part of the methods of our study were visual methods. We asked participants to draw their ideal library space or service. These are the images that were created in these focus groups. Looking through these images, there are some significant themes across them. The first is the need for plants or greenery. In all of the images, there's a space for a green wall, a tree, a living wall, or some other plant-related area. Next is lighting, which mirrors the feedback shared to us during our focus groups. Lighting came in the form of largely natural light, especially through windows and skylights. It was important to the participants that these lights be as close to natural as possible, and they explicitly said so. The nature of the seating areas were important as well, as many noted comfortable seating that could be shared together, while also spaces that were a little more tucked away so that there could be space to focus as well. And finally, large format art made several appearances in the images, whether through the forms of a mural, a painting, or other forms of visual interest. Words that were often used to describe these ideal spaces were open, bright, welcoming, warm, and gathering. So this concludes our presentation. We would be happy to hear your thoughts, your comments, and also answer some of your questions that you may have regarding our presentation today. But thank you all so much for attending today and listening to our discussion on our research project.
Fantastic. Thank you all so much for that wonderful presentation, and very insightful and impactful, I think, for many folks around the table who are doing this work. So thank you for taking the time of being with us today. Happen to open the floor to anybody who has questions. If you have one, you can just raise your hand or drop it in the chat. We'll give our guests a second to also catch their breath, have a drink of water. I have questions, but I like the awkward pressure of when I teach, if students eventually will do that. So somebody's saying, so Artie's saying, thank you so much for your presentation. Are you able to share any of the main findings around digital navigation?
Yes, so we will be writing an article. We're in the process of writing an article where we have all of our findings put together, and we will be publishing it when we are finished that process. One thing I should mention regarding our findings is that this wasn't obviously like a user experience or like a proper user interface, like UX UI type research study. And so the things that we asked about in terms of digital navigation was more around the effective use, like the affective and the emotional aspects of using digital navigation. So folks, really shared with us about kind of like coping mechanisms and talking about epistemic justice rather than saying, what you might expect from a UX UI designed method where, we didn't really talk about like the size of buttons or, where things navigated to, et cetera, et cetera. But yes, we will be eventually publishing our findings. I don't know if my colleagues have anything else to add. I see that there is also another question about what methods we use to find participants for the study. So we certainly tried not to cold call anyone. We didn't do the classic thing where we put like our posters across campus kind of thing. We actually distributed it via listservs that were run by Indigenous Student Services, which is First Nations House, the Center for Indigenous Studies, and other places where in the Indigenous Education Network for their students only listserv, places where students already know that there is some sort of vetting so that, we aren't just some strangers. Hopefully people recognized some or all of us as well through our work as library staff, and really trying to build out from the kinds of trusted relationships that we already had. So we made sure that they came from places that Indigenous students already frequented and that they already trusted, not to sort of just let anybody in, because I think, as we all know, there are many extractive practices when it comes to Indigenous research, and we wanted to make sure that everybody knew that we were really, really focused on the ethics and the relationality and the accountability of our methods as well.
Thank you. Shirley's also asking, I would imagine that Desmond gets all of the students who are looking for Indigenous topics. Do you also get all the students who are Indigenous looking for various topics, and how do you navigate that?
Basically, yes. I think one of the things that happens all the time is and that we really face as an institution is that, when somebody comes in with a specific focus, so in my case, of course, like Indigenous studies, they sort of become like the de facto Indigenous librarian, or like the Indigenous services librarian, as well as like more like sounding more like the like librarian for Black students, and also becoming sort of like the de facto DEI librarian in that space. I have done a lot of work with my colleagues to try to make them understand, or to help us all understand, when someone is asking a question as an Indigenous student versus when someone is looking for an Indigenous topic. So we have done a lot of work around like really focusing on the skills that we already have as librarians, and kind of really distilling it down, rather than sort of leaning into this impulse to kind of send everything to me, because oftentimes we also want to make sure that we're not kind of volleying students back and forth, and so sometimes someone is actually asking a law question. I am not a law librarian, and so it would be best to sort of redirect them to the law librarians with as little sort of back and forth as possible, so that it's like the least confusing for the student, as efficient as possible. Because the more we kind of volley people around, the more people get lost, and we kind of like the more gaps and cracks we create where people can kind of slip through the cracks a little bit.
Thank you. I see Danielle also has a question that they would like to ask, so I will toss it over and then go back to the comments.
Good afternoon. My name is Danielle Marie Bitts. I am the Indigenous Engagement Librarian at the University of Winnipeg. I'm also the librarian for Women and Gender Studies, and for a couple of different master's programs that are associated with that. So Desmond, I completely relate to becoming the de facto EDI librarian. My question is about teaching relationality, and how's that project going, and what are the methods that you're using to facilitate learning in your colleagues around Indigenous relationality? And is that something that's come out of this project, or is it something you're working towards thus far?
I feel like I'm answering all the questions, so my deep apologies for taking up so much space. Yes, certainly sort of talking about accountability and relationality is something that we have been doing since the second I started at the University of Toronto Libraries. We have a lot of professional development type programming at the library where we really try to encourage staff to directly meet Indigenous folks on campus. So, we've had elders come in, we have had medicine teachings. We have, although this has not happened yet, but we have received invitations to join in various like sweat lodges, and like there's a Indigenous learning TP on campus that is put together by Indigenous Student Services and cared for by my colleague Jenny Blackbird, who is the First Nations House Resource Center coordinator. So we've sort of really tried to encourage our colleagues to learn on their own, but also to move into Indigenous services and spaces to create those relationships so that folks will know, who to contact, and that there isn't just one of us that is responsible for the whole library, so to speak. There are a lot of us, and we do a lot of different things, all of which offer a lot of value to our students, faculty, and staff. And it's important that we are creating direct relationships so that all of us are engaging in this work, and it's not just sort of considered niche or handled by any one portion of the library. We've also done a lot to kind of break out of the idea of either any sort of like reconciliatory frameworks for just sort of regular things that we do. Like, just because we work with Indigenous people does not mean that like suddenly we're doing a reconciliation or something like that. And also to sort of break out this work from the framework of like diversity, equity, and inclusion, because that's not a super helpful framework in terms of understanding our relationships and obligations to Indigenous peoples. I don't know if any of my other colleagues would like to chime in, and yes.
So quick question from Michael, who's asking whether or not you could share how many participants you had.
We had 7 who were active in the focus groups. I think there were maybe up 9 who responded initially, but for various reasons, we couldn't get them scheduled, and we had a few repeated invitations, but we didn't want to push at some point. So there were 7 who came out.
Thank you. I'm going to merge 2 questions. So Vanessa started by asking, did the study participants have any insights or suggestions on how to handle offensive collection materials, reclassification to avoid offensive subject headings, censoring them, other ideas? But also then Diane kind of also asked, did students appreciate trigger warnings for library catalogs, for example, something like this? As we work on improving access to our collection or revising our subject headings to be more respectful and inclusive, please be aware that you may see certain words or descriptors in the catalog library material which reflect the author's attitude or that of the period in which the item was created and may now be considered offensive. Or do they get frustrated that nothing seems to change at all?
I can address that. So a number of the students actually mentioned that they just did not know how the library was organized. So we didn't get too much information in the way of like how to reorganize the library from the students themselves, because they weren't aware of all the underlying structures that were in place that make up how subject headings are made. And they were aware that they could see Indians of North America sometimes, but they didn't necessarily know like that was Library of Congress classification system. That being said, as addressing the trigger warnings, the U of T librarians, and I'm sure May can fill in more information about this, they were working hard to mask subject headings and also to formulate a trigger warning or a statement of awareness as we were conducting the research. So there was no information or feedback from the students on that either, because it had not been put in place yet. But that would certainly be an interesting thing to go back and talk to the students about. I don't know if anybody else has anything to add.
Yeah, well, one thing that I recall it was sort of students didn't actually have any suggestions on how to handle the materials, but one idea that it did give us in terms of how they responded was kind of like a visceral reaction to being in the physical stacks and seeing really old racist things next to things that are current and current and beneficial to the student. And so it kind of started giving us idea about like maybe we need to take a look at this collection and remove the really old historical things and put that into our like print preservation storage. So while they may have some historical research value, but it doesn't need to be sitting on the stacks where it's just openly visible. Robarts Library does have a stacks kind of overcrowding situation, so it's like all the stacks actually need to be reviewed. But if we had to like target like an area to be thoughtful about moving the materials, that's one way. So, but the student didn't suggest that. It was just more like they were like, why do I have to see this? And I'm like, yeah, you're right.
I will also just quickly add that so as Cora very quickly alluded to, we are working towards masking or getting taking out offensive subject headings from our catalog. And so there is an aforementioned Indians of North America, which has now been replaced by significantly better terms like Indigenous peoples and then North America or South America what have you, which of course is not perfect, but is better than what it was before. Recently we also got rid of the term that was being used by the Library of Congress subject headings for Two-Spirit people called Indian gays. We recently replaced those with Two-Spirit people as well, which is, I think we can all agree, a significant improvement over what was previously in the catalog. So we are undergoing that process, and we are working through a process of having a space where users can report seeing these kinds of subject headings so that we can start tackling them from various points as well. That's going along with sort of like a trigger warning or like a offensive language in the catalog statement that we're working on together as well.
Thank you for those responses. There are 4 comments in the chat, but I'll go to in person to Natalie. And I'm just noting Indian gays. That's very funny because when I was just up north doing some work on a reservation, there was a group of young gay people who were calling themselves like the res gays and the Indian gays, and as kind of their funny kind of group name back together. But interesting how these come out in library. So over to Natalie.
Hi, thanks so much for the presentation. As someone who spent a lot of time in Robarts, I can definitely relate to some of the points mentioned, especially the lighting. My question is for Tina and Cora, actually. So now that you're working at different institutions, Cora at York and Tina at Wilfrid Laurier, informally, obviously, because you probably haven't done studies yet, but do you notice any differences or similarities in the challenges that you identified in this study to kind of what you're experiencing at your current institutions?
Yes. I think a lot of the issues as it pertains to like physical space, they don't really translate over to Scott Library, for example, because some of the things that the students really wanted, we actually have in place at Scott Library, such as a lot of natural light, greenery, artwork, even a place where people can go and have large discussions in the collaboratory if they like. That being said, I think there is a lot of work to do around addressing like the systemic issues with cataloging materials properly with proper terms and subject headings, and the materials that we have on site, the physical materials, they are shelved the same way they would be shelved at U of T with a mixture of anthropological texts next to contemporary Indigenous authors. That being said as well, I was particularly interested in some of the safety issues that the participants brought up. We don't have lights turning off at Scott Library. We don't have the automatic lights, but I think it is interesting to sort of go into a space with like a trauma-informed gaze and think about like, are there things in this space that that could be potentially like upsetting or harmful or damaging to people. So I think that is something that I definitely would like to look at, as well as the other things that we need to address at York. But I'll pass it over to Tina.
Hey, so I started very recently, so I am not super qualified to talk about kind of some of like the issues that they're facing. The most pressing issue that I think like differs from U of T is budgeting, which is not to say that like U of T does not have budgeting issues, rather than it's a much smaller institution, and so they have to figure out ways to do a lot more with a very limited budget. And so as a result of that, it's quite easy to see where their priorities are, and they are not with Indigenous studies. Although in regards to space, I do think Laurier's library benefits greatly from architectural choices, because the entire library is more or less windows. And so that very nicely solves Robarts' problem with the lighting, because you get a lot of natural light. And so even though there isn't very much plant or greeneries inside the library, the general feel is very much improved because it's so bright and you can see a lot of trees outside. And so it's very interesting just kind of like thinking about how like just like kind of location and how the surrounding area around the library also like contributes to how the library feels inside, even if you're not seeing it, because inside Robarts it feels isolating because it's this giant concrete building with very thick walls, but the area surrounding UT is also just roads and other buildings with very little greenery. And so all of that kind of just piles on to give Robarts an even more isolating feeling that it already has. And so I think Laurier can do things to better capitalize on the benefit of having that kind of location with a lot of greenery outside. And yeah, I suspect my answer will change in a few months, as these things tend to do. But for now, my answer is more or less, I guess it's a bit of a non-answer, but yeah, we'll see.
Thank you. Just coming back, because this is a bit of a similar question from Nicole, but given the confines of the space at Robarts, what can be done to improve the greenery, the art, the natural light, noting that it's quite tricky. And I think this also goes down to William's comment. Also at York, the Scott Library, very similar to Robarts, very brutalist. Even if we think of TMU, like lots of institutions like UBC, when I've been to many of these universities, very similar in this. And if you have any thoughts around that.
Yeah, maybe I can speak to that. So the timing of the focus groups also coincided with a whole bunch of building projects that was either nearing completion or have already been completed. And because the timing of the focus groups was like around the time when we're still in pandemic and people haven't been around campus for a long time, the focus groups provided a great opportunity to share information about these development. So Robarts Common, I don't know if any of you have been down there yet, but it is has a lot more light than regular Robarts. And we took the opportunity to like we were given a tour of the new facilities for staff who have been around for a while, and then there was definitely opportunities where you could put plants in or a plant wall. So, you know, there were so we could think of where there would be possible improvements, but we also wanted to take the opportunity to promote some of the space improvements that were happening. So in addition to the Robarts Common wing being built, some of the reference spaces on the 4th floor had been refreshed during the pandemic, so it's much more open. I don't think there's more natural light because it's a bunker here, but it's no longer crowded with stacks. Things have opened up and it's a bit friendlier, the space. So you know, I mean, I think the space is a tricky thing, right? Like there's only so much we can rebuild here, but there's room for improvement for sure. With Reynolds and with Robarts Commons still kind of new, there could be some new aesthetics to be put there. And one of the focus group participants that I end up running into, I said, hey, you know, you want to come to Robarts Common and take a look? And, you know, and it was really just neat to see like, oh yes, this is a place I can come and sit, look through the window and, you know, reflect on things. So, you know, people were putting together what they had said they had wanted and seeing that there are spaces and options available on campus to meet some of those needs.
And so what are some of your next steps going to be? How will you move forward responding to the feedback that you've received? And that's a comment from Hillary.
So that's a great question. One of the things that we will be doing, and we have already been doing, is of course sharing out some of our results to the wider library community. Like we said, some of it is maybe directly relevant and some of it might not necessarily be relevant. One of the things that we're doing internally as part of the review of the calls to action and the TRC review, there was a final report that was written for the University of Toronto, like for the entire university. And one of the things that was said was for any sort of new space planning that there needs to be some sort of study regarding how Indigenous students see the spaces and, you know, like understanding like Indigenous uses of spaces across campus. So this is really going to be instrumental in sort of spaces moving forward, that we have these kinds of suggestions and information for features to look out for. That can be a starting point so students can continue to give their opinions as well. Another thing that we're going to be doing is we will be thinking about kind of like the conceptions of safety and what safety means, and sort of thinking about things like surveillance, like surveillance capitalism through our services, and also, you know, the presence of things like safety signs and quote unquote safety officers and police officers in the library and things like that. So these are things that we will be making recommendations around as well, and hopefully be making the spaces more hospitable for Indigenous students. There's not a lot that we can do about brutalist architecture as a style, but I think that there are things that we can do to suggest to our colleagues how we might make the spaces safer and better for our Indigenous users, and to invite Indigenous users to think about the library as a space that is also theirs, and not a space that is outside of, you know, what they are comfortable using.
And one thought that comes to mind with that question around next steps is, so while we're just very new on the circuit and sharing information out, we're still trying to like finish writing up our findings in an article. But Desmond, I'm thinking that I need to maybe put this on the senior staff agenda, and also do a version of this presentation for our staff internally. We haven't really discussed that yet. But I'm only saying this because in a couple of projects that Desmond and I have been part of before, it was really hard to get buy-in on certain things like, you know, with description, until we engaged a broader group of people to support the work that and the findings that we are finding. So that would be a very concrete action item that I can do, is to find some time to get onto the senior staff agenda.
So just a comment, I believe, from William more so than a question, but I wonder how much the University of Toronto Library saves on electricity by turning off the robots lighting, which is unsettling. And I think we see lots of these questions popping up across campuses, lighting, where are we cutting services, et cetera, and how does that impact overall safety for many different types of students. Michael says, I often see a moment as people get to know the library when they want to know more about the actual internal workings of that library. And it makes them wonder if a transparent library kind of programming might be very much welcome.
Yeah. That would be great. We try to do I work on social media for the library that I work in as well, and our posts about the sort of behind the scenes working is they're always very popular. So that's a great suggestion. Thank you.
I just wanted to add, one of the things that liaison librarians do is that they have I think they call it a moving librarian, and so they establish relationships with the writing center. And so when students go to the writing center, depending on the time of year, they may be a liaison librarian there, just kind of hovering around, because when students have questions, it is one thing to just tell them to go to the library, but it's a different thing when the librarian is there and physically able to help them on the spot. And so having librarians, I think, move around a lot more is also an interesting way of integrating the library into students' lives a bit more. So then it's not just them coming to us, but also us going to them.
So a question from Deborah is, did you see much of a difference in your results when comparing with the earlier study that was published in 2001?
Hi, Deborah. Unfortunately, there was a lot of the same issues that came up as the results of your study. Lack of Indigenous resources in the library system, lack of concern and involvement in Indigenous issues, even knowing that Desmond had been there and most of our participants knew Desmond and they knew all the outreach work he was doing. Still, the general impression of the library services and the library as a whole were not drastically different from what was published in 2001.
And I think that would be the same across many studies. We just finished a fairly comprehensive study in the Faculty of Health around anti-Black and anti-Indigenous racism at York. And we look back comparatively to 10 years before, and many of the themes haven't changed. Much of the issues are kind of still there, slow progress. And so I think it's about really how we take this up and push this forward. And so within our faculty specifically, we said, you have to embed this work within the work of council as an oversight body, that there are active groups that are working towards this with active progress milestones, et cetera, to start to see change. Because what we also heard back, and I don't know, maybe you heard it in your responses, but people are really getting tired of participating in some of these questionnaires, and they're very frustrated. I'm seeing lots of nodding heads from groups that people are saying, we've already told you what's wrong. And especially at universities, I think faculty, staff, students have been saying, we've already told you over and over and over again. We keep telling you what's wrong and nothing changes. And so we're just getting tired of telling you. Don't know if anybody wants to respond to that. Otherwise, I can just run to some more comments.
I think one of the things, I think that this is something that's very frustrating. It always feels like we're sort of circularly chasing our tail a little bit. Deborah did this work in 2001, and we are just here we are 20 years later, 21 years later, now 22, sort of talking about some of the same things. I think that some of the things that we need to recognize as well, though, is that some people have impressions of the library that were the University of Toronto libraries that were created outside of the University of Toronto libraries as well, and have a general impression of libraries, which I think is totally fair. And the thing is, we're not, as libraries, we're not a monolith. So while some of us can be really working towards being responsive, others, like other colleagues, might be earlier on their journeys of being responsive, or maybe not on the journey of being responsive. And so we really need to kind of work at looking at the overall impact of what research studies like this will do, and trying to get it as far and wide as possible as well, so that this can be a consistent experience. I think also a lot of people have had some really bad experiences in public libraries to do with safety and epistemic violence in collections. And this is something that we need to do like better writ large. Like when we talk about kind of like masking our subject headings or getting rid of them in our catalog, we are only able to impact that from our catalog. So if someone went to a different catalog, they would then see Indians of North America and Indian gays and other kinds of offensive terms. So we really need to work on this writ large as well. It can't just be us.
I'm just noting a comment from Shirley that the Gabriel Dumont Institute has a note on their website for their library about who's allowed to actually access old and historic books, not recommended collections, items that were written for children with stereotypes, factual errors, misrepresentations, omissions, etc., that are not recommended for casual use without the understanding of the criticisms about their context. And so with that, another kind of comment that's come down here is a thank you for your presentation, but also I believe this type of study could be beneficial for public libraries and their consultations with local Indigenous communities. I'm wondering if the study participants will be informed of the short-term and long-term impacts of their feedback, short-term being changes in the physical library spaces, long-term impacts potentially panel attendance numbers, examples of other libraries using this model.
Yes, first of all, hi, Deanna. Also, we are keeping in touch with our participants who indicated through the consent process that they wanted to stay in touch. There were some who wanted to say their piece and kind of just ride off into the sunset. And of course, we respect that, which is great. But there are other folks who want to be kept abreast of some of the changes that they are helping create. We actually did, this study was also modeled on a similar study that I worked on, also that was led by Deborah Lee, which looked at this basically the same model, but with faculty members. And similarly, faculty members wanted to sort of stay on top of the progress that we were making. So we're using the same sort of model that we already have for updating faculty about some of the changes, largely through word of mouth, through seeing them at community events, and then also, you know, occasionally keeping them up to date if there's a specific thing that happened. If we have any publications, sending them over to them as well for their perusal and for their review. So we're trying to keep them interested and engaged in that way, so that they feel, hopefully our participants feel like they have some ownership over some of the changes that are happening over in the library as well.
Thank you. So Nicole says, thank you from Osgood Hall Library at York, and is just interested in a tour of Scott Library, noting that our spaces were recently renovated, and I feel that these space issues were addressed successfully in the planning, but we'll be taking another walkthrough from a student perspective with all of this in mind. And then a question here. So question was wondering about intersectional books often have a hard time finding two-spirited LGBTIQ books and other Indigenous authors with disabilities, and in the disability ability justice books. And also the specific language books to build on practices, reading materials beyond just technical workbooks or one book. Was curious other ways beyond title suggestion forms, forms after forms, to these resources, and have been surprised about collections, and was wondering how much are chosen with specific First Nation, Inuit, Métis kind of in mind. Also Indigenous sign language resources, etc.
So I think if I maybe unpack that question in response a little bit, yeah, certainly they're like sort of like the intersecting identities can be really, really challenging when we are describing these things. So like I think about like a book like Manisha Kabi's book talking about being a two-spirit elder. So like a two-spirit person, an elder, a Anishinaabe person, and then also someone who has a disability. Some of those things tend to get lost in terms of the intersecting identities. We try really hard to be really sensitive to those things, but I think the truth is we don't have like a perfect answer or a particularly articulate answer. This is something that we have been looking at and have been like really, really trying to figure out as well. The nature of academic librarianship is that we are very siloed. So, you know, we look at things from a disability justice lens, or we look at things from an Indigenous justice lens, or you know, like a gender and sexuality lens. But we have a very hard time kind of connecting the dots for people who are, you know, Black, queer, disabled activists, for instance. Like we really find it challenging to kind of do right from all of those spaces as well. And so I think that is definitely something that we need to continue to work on. And I don't really have a, like, I wish I had a great answer, but I unfortunately, I don't.
So comment from Vanessa in response to Desmond's comments about more than one library making positive change in subject headings at Emily Carr University of Arts and Design in Vancouver. We are working with a consortia to change offensive subject headings for materials related to Indigenous peoples or works by Indigenous authors. This means that more than one library will see changes in its subject headings, yet at the same time, because more libraries have to agree on the way forward, this process can take substantially longer. And I think this is the case across many of the subject areas that like we're kind of working with a number of other universities on some initiatives. And as soon as you start adding folks, these things certainly take up a great deal of time and can feel really, really slow. I feel like doing EDI work at times can feel overwhelming. At the same time, very slow, like nothing is happening. Yet at the same time, there's so much kind of happening behind the scenes and a lot of push and pull and a lot of justification because most of these items take money and resources, and that within the academic institutions that we lay bare in that can be very difficult.
I think one thing that strikes me as well is that the institutions that we work in are not very tolerant of the time it takes for ethical work. There are really big checklists that we always have to, you know, that they will really want us to sort of fit in and they want us to get through and don't really give us time to do the sort of like really deep relational stuff that needs to happen in order to subvert heteropatriarchy, like white supremacy and things that we're trying to sort of root out of the systems, if it's even possible.
Great. So with that, I'm going to close us out and thank you all very much for joining us. And so a very special thank you to Desmond, May, Tina, and Cora for sharing their valuable insights with us today, and to everyone who attended this first SICL Research Seminar of 2023. I also want to acknowledge our SICL staff who made this event possible. So a special thank you to Lindsay and Natalie for their work behind the scenes. And just a note that we'll be sending along a small gift of appreciation from the center to all of our presenters. Before you all sign off, I'd just like to make you aware of some upcoming SICL events. Tomorrow, we have a webinar presented in partnership with Seed Exchange and the Faculty of Urban and Environmental Change to discuss an Indigenous perspective on seed sovereignty, as well as we have an in-person research lecture this week by Dr. Ted Jojola titled Place Knowing and Rematriation, Indigenous Design and Planning. For more information on these events, we'd encourage you to go to our website. And so we thank you for joining us today. Thank you all so much.